Hey, it's that time of the week, PodApplaud time, the weekly show that exists to enable your podcast habit. How are you, my precious pod people? I'm your host, Seb, and I'm here to rant, rave, and applaud for all those sweet, sweet pods. This week, I have a short podcast news bit. I'm going to offer up 4 podcast recommendations. And after that, I'm going to close out the show by talking a bit about the Limetown Season 2 close. Don't worry though, I will keep it spoiler free. Alright, for podcast news this week, I'd like to talk about PodCon2. January 9th and 20th, you can look forward to PodCon2 in Seattle, Washington. This is an interesting event because you can attend remotely. If you pony up 40 buckaroos, you will be sent a password you can use to listen to nearly the whole event after it has wrapped up. Many of the going-ons are panels, workshops, meet and greets, and variety shows. But I wouldn't be talking about it if it didn't also include a healthy amount of live podcasts. Ono Ross and Carrie, Punch Up the Jam, Buffering the Vampire Slayer, Hello from the Magic Tavern, Still Buffering, My Brother and Me, Good Morning Night Vale, The Broadswords, Sci-Fi Show Tangents, The Stoop, Delete This, Dear Hank and John, Analyze This, and Sawbones are all putting on live shows. There's definitely a wide gamut of shows featuring funny shows, informative shows, educational and investigative. Sounds like a very good event if you're a fan of the McElroy brothers or getting close and personal with some of your podcasting heroes. Do people have podcast heroes? Is that a thing? Now, I would like to talk about my recommendations that I have this week. First up is Mind's Eye by the Parcast Network. This is their first fictional show. It's a compelling listen for fictional true crime fans. Wait a minute. Wait. Fictional true crime? Is that a thing? Isn't it just fictional crime? Well, I guess true crime as a genre is an institution in podcasting. So I guess it's only natural that it would become so large a fictional true crime show would exist that isn't just a fictional crime show. My point is that if you're into puzzling thrillers, serial killer stories, and possible elements of psychosis, this is a show for you. Homicide detective Kate finds herself interviewed by her journalist husband for a story in which her constant nightmares are the subject. As the plot develops, crimes, both current and of the past, become increasingly disclosed, yet more mysterious. We learn of how deeply involved Kate is in a particular case, and just how her dreams may tie in. I find myself guessing at the puzzle differently as little bits of information presents itself. We get new insight into Kate's mind, both waking and asleep, along with her motivations. Her inner turmoil strains her relationships, though, as it slowly erodes the trust people place with her. So far, I have really been enjoying the drama and mystery. I eagerly hope the payoff is as strong as the setup. I also think the voice acting and casting is exquisite. I find every character to be quite believable. I'm sure that this clever show will prove to be mind sly and not a mind sigh. Next, I would like to talk about Strong Songs. Strong Songs follows one of the perfect formulas for a great podcast. That being, someone who is well informed and passionate about a topic, breaks it down, and shares their expertise. That someone is Kirk Hamilton, and his topic is what exactly makes a great song, an excellent song, so memorable? Kirk breaks down so many little parts of songs that I have never noticed before, like how the play between tension and resolution contributes to Beyonce's Single Ladies being such a dynamic song, or how a particular portion of the bass solo in Paul Simon's Call Me Al is actually unplayable due to being partially reversed studio magic. I'm generally not up to speed, or should I say tempo, with all the terms Kirk uses breaking down these songs, but he plays clips and makes everything he is mentioning quite apparent. The small snippets and bits of music played under the analysis are also satisfyingly enough to groove on. Kirk's adoration of the music shines through. When he says something like, "That's the greatest count in to a horn section I've ever heard," you can tell he is genuinely geeking out over the music and is exceedingly spirited when it comes to the topic at hand. I'm enjoying this podcast a lot, just as a lover of music. I can only imagine how much a musician or a composer would get out of the show. The next show I want to talk about is Aria Code. Aria Code is the best podcast pun name maybe I have ever heard. An aria is an elaborate melody sung by a single singer and accompanied by an orchestra. Most typically, aria is used in reference to an opera, and that is the focus of this show. Each episode, Aria Code takes a look at a single song sung by one character in an opera. Host Rhiannon Giddens is usually joined by a guest who has performed the aria on stage, and a few other guests who have insight of the story or themes the story of the aria touches upon. One thing to mention is that most operas are not English in origin. To make up for this, Rhiannon and her guest will disassemble the aria line by line, speaking upon what the characters sang, how they feel, and their motivations within the plot. This is really the storytelling backbone of the podcast. Everything else is interesting, but this part of the podcast tells a story. Here and there, they will have an aside to discuss an idea that comes up over the course of the song. The guests are all well spoken and tell a potent tale every episode. I especially like that there is always someone who has performed the aria involved to share their unique outlook of the character. Then, at the end of the show, when you have had your fill of perspective, they play a beautiful rendition of the aria for the listening enjoyment of the audience. I'm not sure if people who have little interest in opera will be taken with this podcast the same way I am. I will say, though, that if there is any podcast that will awaken your interest in opera, it might just be this one. On to Mythology. Mythology is a new podcast put out by the PodCast Network. It is about 5 episodes in and releasing every Tuesday. So far, it has been a standout amongst the multitude of mythology and lore podcasts due to its sheer production value. I adore all the effort and stories told by the smaller teams and single-person operations, but mythology just happens to be something else. The narration is professionally delivered by Vanessa Richardson. There is thematic music, sound effects, and most importantly, the characters within the stories are all voice acted as well. So far on the podcast, they have taken a 2-episode look into the Greek god Athena. They are now covering Loki of Norse fame, and on the website it teases that stories will be pulled from Germanic folklore in Native American origin tales. I am excited that this podcast will be covering mythology all over the world. The episodes so far have told the tale of one character at a time, hopping story to story quick enough to be insightful, but not lingering long enough or diving too deep into the details as to slow the pace of the narrative. That is the mainstay of the podcast. Its narrative style. So far, the podcast has not bothered too much with the heavy handed symbolism of mythology or delving into metaphor. They focus on the characters, their motivations, and do so in plain modern speech that doesn't require any parsing. So if you just want to hear the tales of these characters, Mythology is an amazing podcast. All right. Well, it's time to cater to the bingers and recommend a show that has wrapped up its latest season recently. I don't think there are many podcast fans out there who have not yet heard of Limetown. But just in case, let's talk Limetown. Personally, just a month ago, I had not even listened to a single episode of Limetown. I had seen it all over the web. I had heard about it becoming a TV show. I had multiple people recommend this podcast to me, but I never took the plunge. After just an episode or two, though, I could understand the hype. And I got my girlfriend aboard the hype train as well. Limetown is a fictional investigative podcast done right. Despite being fictional, the cast has a serial like vibe and takes just enough time to establish the setting in a convincing way. If you didn't know it was a fictional podcast, for the first episode, you'd be hard pressed to separate it from a very strong piece of investigative journalism. We followed the investigation of Leah Haddock, who is determined to discover exactly the events that unfolded in the inexplainable Limetown Exodus. A whole town of people, including Leah's uncle, up and vanished overnight, without a trace. That's the setup to season 1. The intrigue is thick enough to cut with a knife, like some sort of key Limetown pie. The danger and depths of Limetown secrets really threaten our protagonist, Leah Haddock, who the fans of the show have really fallen for. With season 2 comes a few key new characters to the show, complete with enigmatic backgrounds and troublesome motivations. The story takes a definite shift with the new voices. All the intrigue and deception remains. For some fans, though, it seems season 2 felt like a departure. I think season 1 endears you to many of its characters, especially Leah, and leaves you seeking closure. Closure that eludes the listener all the way through season 2, in which you find yourself surrounded by characters you resent. Looking back at the whole journey, after listening to Limetown, I would recommend it. I can see how fans who waited each painful week got exasperated waiting for answers. But now that this show is bingeable, you can stay up way past your bedtime and soak up the entirety of this sinister plot. Okay, that is the show for the day. Thank you for tuning in and listening thus far. If you enjoyed yourself, please subscribe, review, or tell your friends about this podcast. I also want to have a segment on the show where I try to solve your podcast questions or problems, so feel free to reach out to me with those. So until next week, later, my precious podcast people. Looking to submit a news article, an audio clip, or email praising one of your favorite podcasts, or share live show events? Send anything you'd like discussed on the show to PodApplaud PodApplaud@gmail.com or find me on Twitter at PodApplaud.